Hi, in this video we're going to talk about Simio user interface and its different components, and we'll talk about how we can navigate to different components of our Simio project in the user interface. We will also talk about some additional learning resources that the users can use to become more familiar with Simio. So I think with this brief introduction, we're ready to go ahead and start talking about the Simio user interface.
So as you can see, Simio has the same standard ribbon-based user interface. So we can see different ribbons here on the top. So we have the project home and the components that are related to our project. So we can add models to our project or add experiments. We can also configure our the parameters that are related to our run configuration here. And there are other tabs that we will talk about as we build other models in Simio. But one of the things that I would like to talk about here is a support ribbon, which provides very useful resources to new users. So in the support ribbon, you will see that you can have access to sample SimBit solutions. So SimBits are very small or basic simulation models that are available to you to show you how you can implement different logics in Simio. So if you click on sample SimBits here, you can search for the terms that are related to the logic you're trying to add to your model. So let's say you would like to add server failures. So you can simply type failures here, and you can see all the SimBits that are related to adding different types of failures to your model components. There are also complete simulation models that you can look at and get an idea of what kind of models you can build with Simio. And these are available to you in the examples. And you can also see a list of helpful books and other helpful resources like videos, training, and user forum where you can post questions and hopefully get answer to your questions in the support ribbon. So what I'd like to do now is to go back to our model and talk about the other components of the main user interface. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we have the standard library and the objects that are in it. So you can hover the mouse on any of these object definitions, and you can read a short description of each object. So for example, the source object may be used to generate entities and so on. There is also the navigation window on the right-hand side, and you can select different components of your project in the navigation window. So let's say right now I have the model selected, and here I can see the processes, definitions, data, and other components that are related to my model. Now, if I go ahead and select model entity, then what I see is definitions and data and other components that are related to my model entity. So it is really important to make sure that you have the right component of your project or your model selected before modifying or adding components to your simulation model. So what I'd like to do now is build a very simple model and talk about some other components of the Simio user interface. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a source from the standard library and drag it on the facility window. So I can click on the source object, and just wherever I want to place the source, I can left click once again, and the object instance will be placed in that location. I can also just grab it and put it wherever I want, and then release the left click button. I can also double click on any object definition, and then I will basically switch to the multi-placement mode, where I can place multiple instances of that object definition wherever I want in the model. I can just right click and I exit the multi-placement mode. So let me just go ahead and delete these different source object instances that I created. Now what I need is a server object instance and finally a sink. So each of these objects are designed to perform different tasks. For example, the source object generates entities. The server object processes entities. So it has an input buffer where entities wait if the processing station is occupied, and then entities get processed in the processing station. And finally, there is an output buffer where entities wait if they can't be transferred or transported to their next destination at this time. So the other thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to connect these up using path object instances. So I just double clicked on path object definition, so I'm in the multi-placement mode, and I can go ahead and connect my objects together. And then again, in order to exit the multi-placement mode, I can just right click. So now we have our basic model implemented, and I can go ahead and run this model. And as you can see, my source generates entities. They arrive at the server. If the server is available, they get processed. Otherwise, they wait in the input buffer. And then after they're processed, they move to the sink. And the sink object basically destroys the entity that is leaving the system. So I can pause here, I can stop the model, I can run in step mode. So what the step mode does is it moves to the next event that occurs in the simulation. So here, when I step forward, the process for this entity is completed. So as you can see, I can hover the mouse on each entity realization and find out its ID. So this is default entity number 53. This guy is default entity 54. So I can step again. Now I'm at 0.19 hours. If I step, my entity enters the processing station and I'm still at the same simulation time. And then when I step forward again, now my entity travels to my sink, and I can continue stepping forward to the next event that occurs during the simulation run. So the step mode is very useful when you're debugging a simulation model. There is also the fast forward mode. So if I click fast forward, the model is run to completion. So in this case, my starting time is 12 a.m. on January 19, 2015. My ending time is 24 hours later, 12 a.m. January 20th, 2015. So here you can see I have run my model for 24 hours. The run is complete 100%. And I can also go to my results tab right here. And here I see the Simio pivot table where I can find different statistics based on my simulation run. So for instance, I can go to the results related to my server, and then here I see the scheduled utilization. So as you can see, the pivot table has different components, and we talk about its different components in detail in a different video module. So let's go back to our facility view. Let's stop, and as you can see, after I stop the model, I still have the results here. If I reset, the results will also reset. So the next thing that I'd like to do is talk about object properties. So if I click on my source object instance, you can see on the right hand side I have the properties window. So under the properties window there are several categories. So for instance, under the entity arrival logic, I can control the arrival of my entities created by my source object. Now when you click on these different properties, you won't be able to change them. They are grayed out, and that's because my model is not stopped. So if I go ahead and stop the model, so I can just click on this little stop button right here, I can go to the run ribbon and hit stop. So now when I click on my source object, I can actually go ahead and change these properties. They're not grayed out anymore. So again, there are different categories of properties. So under the entity arrival logic, I can change the arrival mode. So here I'm creating entities based on an inter-arrival type of arrival. So I can change that to arrival table or time varying arrival rates. Again, these are the things that are covered in the other videos. I can also change the inter-arrival time. So let me just expand this so you can see the name of these different properties. So here I have the inter-arrival time, and the default expression is random.exponential 0.25. So essentially right now my source creates entities based on an exponential inter-arrival time. And this expression tells me that inter-arrival times are exponentially distributed with mean 0.25. And if I click on this little button right here, I can see the units. So 0.25 minutes is the average inter-arrival time in my model. I can also look at other properties of my source object. So there are different categories. There is stopping conditions. So I can set the maximum number of arrivals before the source stops creating entities. I can set a maximum time for my source. So you can click on the name of each property and you can see a description of it below. So if I select inter-arrival time here, it says the time interval between two successive arrivals, and that's what this property does for us. This property may be specified using a random sample from a distribution like what we have here. We have an exponential distribution here. I can select on, let's say, maximum arrivals, and you can read the description. It's a limit on the total number of arrivals to be automatically generated by this source object during the simulation run. So again, that's an important thing. So if you're not sure what a property does, you can read its description, and that's a great help. And you can see the other property categories for the source object. So you can expand these and read their description. So one thing that I would like to point out is that different objects have different property categories. So if I go to my server properties, now you see that I have this process logic that the source object does not have, because the source object does not process entities. On the other hand, the source object has entity arrival logic category because it creates entities, while my server does not create entities, so it does not have that property category. So again, different objects have different property categories. So let's have a look at a few of them for the server object. So in my server, I have the capacity. It can be fixed, or you can set it using a work schedule. Again, the work schedule is covered in detail in a different module. You can set its capacity. So right now when I run the model, the capacity is 1, so I can have only one entity processed at a time. Let me stop the model and change this to 2. So now when I run my model, my server has a capacity of 2, so I can process 2 entities simultaneously. So let's stop, change this back to 1. You can also change the ranking rule, how the entities will be sorted and in what order the server will select them to process. So right now the default is first in, first out. So whoever comes first gets served first. There is a processing time. Again, the default is triangularly distributed with 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3 minutes. And there is also other property categories. There is the buffer capacity. So you can change the input buffer capacity or the output buffer capacity. So right now, I can hold an infinite number of entities in my input buffer. If I go ahead and change that to 1, then I have limited the capacity of my input buffer to 1. So when I run the model, I will see at most one entity here, and the rest of them will wait on my path object. So let's go ahead and change this back to infinity. And like I mentioned, you can go ahead and read the description for different properties of your object. And as I mentioned, different objects have different set of properties. So for instance, if I look at the combiner object, it has a matching logic because the combiner combines or batches entities, so we need to know what conditions are used to batch different entities together. So the server object or the source object do not have this matching logic property category. So another thing that I would like to mention is that whenever you select an object and you see that a property category is collapsed, that means all of the properties in that property category are set to their default value. So if I open my buffer capacity property category, you can see that input buffer and output buffer are both set to infinity, which is their default value. Or if I open the reliability logic, we don't have any failures, which is again the default value for the failure type property. Now, if I go ahead and change, let's say, the input buffer capacity to a value other than the default value, let's say I change it to 1. Now, two things will happen. First, the non-default value appears in a bold font. So whenever you see a value, a property value that is bolded, that means it's not set to its default value and the user has changed it. So for instance, if I go ahead and change my processing time distribution, let's say I just change the lower bound. Instead of 0.1, I change it to 0.05. Now when I say OK, the expression for my processing time is bolded, which means we have changed the default processing time expression. The other thing that happens is that if I deselect and reselect my server object again, what you're going to see is that those property categories where at least one of the properties is not set to its default value will not be collapsed anymore. It'll be expanded. So now when I select my server object, the buffer capacities category is not collapsed anymore, and Simio does this to show you that one or more of the properties in that category are not set to their default value. So if I go ahead and change this to infinity again, which is the default value, deselect and reselect my server, now the buffer capacities category is collapsed. If I change it to 1, deselect and reselect, the buffer capacities category is expanded. Now, some of you may ask, okay, how do I know what expression to put for different properties? In other words, how do I know what these expressions look like and what's the correct format? So one of the nice features of Simio is this tool right here that is called the expression builder. So if you select a property and there is a down arrow on the right hand side, you can click on that down arrow, and what appears is a box that we call the expression builder or the expression editor. So the expression editor essentially allows you to access and use different functions or properties throughout your model. For instance, you can access random distributions or math functions or different properties of different objects in your model. So suppose I would like to change the processing time distribution for my server to exponential with mean 0.2 minutes. So I want to access a random distribution, so I can just go ahead and type random, and what Simio does, it pulls up a list of candidate things that I can use. So when I type random, it automatically moves to this random right here. You can see random is selected. So I can hit the period button and I can access the different distributions that the software provides. So you can either go ahead and type the name of the distribution that you're after, or you can scroll down the list and select the one that you would like to use. So here I would like to use the exponential, so I can just double click on exponential, and then it tells me that it has one argument, and that's the mean processing time, so I can go ahead and put that in. Or I can go ahead and type random, and then random is selected, so I hit period, and then I can just type XEX and exponential is selected. So now when I want to select exponential, I can just hit tab on my keyboard and exponential will be selected. So I can go ahead and change its parameter to 0.2. So now I can either hit enter or click on this green check mark on the right hand side, enter, and now you can see that it is bolded because we have changed the default value. Now we have random.exponential 0.2. I can also access different math functions within Simio using the expression builder. So let's say I want my processing time to be sampled from the exponential distribution with mean 0.2, but I want to use the ceiling of the value that I sample. So I can simply go ahead, I'm going to cut this expression that I have right here, and I'm going to type math, and now when I hit the period button, I can access different math functions available in Simio. So since I want the ceiling, I'm going to go and either double click on ceiling, or I'm just going to say math dot ceiling, and then ceiling will be selected, so I can hit tab and I can plot my value. So the value that I would like to round up. And in this case, I want to round up whatever I sample from my exponential distribution. So the argument will be random.exponential.0.2. Now when I click on the green button, what I see is math.ceiling, and I round up what I sample from my exponential distribution. So I can go ahead and run my model and make sure that everything is working correctly. Now, when you enter a new expression and it appears bolded, that means at least there is no syntax error in the expression that you've entered. Now, suppose instead of one argument for my ceiling function, I input two arguments. Let's say random exponential 0.2, 1. Enter. What happens is Simio throws an error, and it says in your server object, server 1, for the processing time property, this expression that you've entered is invalid. So there is a syntax error there. So as you can see, when I select my server 1, my property processing time is highlighted, indicating a syntax error. So I can go ahead and then verify my expression and fix the problem. So I'm just going to get rid of the second argument and say OK. And now I don't see the error anymore. The error disappears and my model runs perfectly. So using the expression builder, I can also access different properties of the different objects in my model. So let's say I want to set the processing time of my entities to be equal to their priority value. So I can just type in model entity. Since I'm interested in a property of my model entity, I type model entity, and when I do that, let me type this again so you can see what happens. So when I type model, one of the options that Simio gives me is model entity right in the bottom of my drop-down list. So I can hit tab and then hit period, and now I see different properties, states, or functions associated with my model entity. So whenever you see this icon that looks like a hand, that means what you see is a property. If you see f of x, that means it's a function. If you see something like this, that means it's a state. So what I'm interested in is model entity priority. So PRI, and now Simio suggests priority. I can hit tab and select priority, say OK. I'm not getting any errors, so I know that syntax at least is correct. So now my processing time is equal to the priority of my entities. Let me also go ahead and change my input buffer to its default value, so I can either type infinity or I can simply right click and select reset. And when I do that, it'll be changed to its default value, and again it's not bolded, indicating that I'm using the default value for this property. So now when I run my model, since the default priority of entities is equal to 1, my processing time for all of the entities will be exactly 1 minute. And that's why you see that this queue builds up here. So I can extend my input buffer, and you can see all these entities waiting to be processed, because now my arrival is much faster than my processing. So let me stop this model. And what I'd like to do is assign each entity that is created a priority value that works for my model. And I can do this by using repeat groups. So when I select my source, you see I have this state assignments property category. And what it does, it changes the state variable for every entity that is created. So, and before it exits the source object, this assignment happens. So when I select this property, you can see these 3 dots appearing here. And if I click on that, this is what we call a repeating group editor. Now what I can do here is change or specify multiple similar properties in this interface that you see right here. So I'm going to hit add, and now the state variable that I want to change is model entity priority. So I go to model, I hit M. These are all different things that are associated with my model entity. What I need is model entity priority. And then I want its new value to be randomly sampled from my exponential distribution. So I can just go ahead and type random dot exponential tab and then 0.2. So now what happens is whenever an entity is created, I sample its priority value, and then I use that priority value as its processing time. So I can't select the server object to show you the expression right now, but I'll do it after I add one more thing to my repeat group. So like I said, you can specify multiple properties in this interface. So I can hit add, and let's say I want to change the speed of my entity. So I can again I can hit M, and then these are all model entity properties. Let's say I change the desired speed. So the desired speed is defaulted to 1. I'm going to change it to 3 for all of my entities. So that's 3 meters per hour. So now I close this. So now before exiting the source, I sampled the priority, and the priority is used here as the processing time. So each entity now has a different priority, hence a different processing time. So I can go ahead and run my model. Now as you can see, my entity it's actually moving, but it's moving very slowly. So let me just go ahead to my source and fix the units here from per hour to per second. Close. And now when I run, my entities move much faster, and then their processing time is essentially sampled before they exit the source.
So in this video, we talked about the Simio user interface and its ribbon-based structure. We also talked about the support ribbon and the different resources that are available to users to become more familiar with Simio. I highly recommend that you get used to using the support ribbon, especially the SimBits. I think you will be able to find the answer to many of your modeling questions in the SimBits. This concludes our video on the Simio user interface. I hope you enjoy your modeling experience with Simio, and thanks for watching.